In an upscale restaurant managed by a ruthless owner, people were treated differently based on their appearance. When a disheveled man in tattered, worn-out clothes entered, no one welcomed him except for one persona, struggling black waitress working tirelessly just to make ends meet. She was the only one who showed him kindness. What she didn't know was that this man wasn't who he appeared to be, and by helping him, she was about to turn her entire world upside down. In the heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets below, stood the Grand Pearl, a restaurant renowned for its luxury, exclusivity, and clientele who never checked their bank balance before ordering. The air inside was thick with the aroma of gourmet dishes, the hum of polite conversation, and the quiet clinking of fine china against marble tables. It was a place where wealth spoke louder than words, where service was impeccable yet impersonal, and where the presence of a single out-of-place figure could shatter the illusion of perfection. Among the staff bustling about in crisp uniforms was Olivia Johnson, a young black woman with determined eyes and an unshakable spirit. At 25, she had already learned that the world didn't hand out kindness easily, especially not to people like her. Every day she navigated the unspoken rules of this place, where guests were treated like royalty while employees were expected to be invisible. She was no stranger to long hours, aching feet, or condescending sneers from both customers and management alike. But none of that mattered, not when there were bills to pay and, more importantly, a mother waiting at home battling an illness that didn't care how many shifts Olivia had to take to afford her medication. Her boss, Victor Blake, ruled the restaurant with an iron grip. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his perfectly tailored suits and slicked-back hair gave him an air of importance. But his true nature lurked beneath the surface. Victor was a man who believed in appearances above all else. What you were, how much you were worth, and most importantly, whether or not you belonged. To him, his employees were nothing more than replaceable cogs in a machine, and his disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow mold of respectability was made clear in the way he spoke to them, the way he looked at them, the way he reminded them, subtly or otherwise, that they were beneath him. It was just another evening at the Grand Pearl when the routine was interrupted. The doors swung open, and a man stepped inside. Decimus Ramirez, a figure so out of place in this world of luxury that the entire room seemed to stiffen at his arrival. His clothes were old and tattered, his hair unkempt, his shoes worn down to their soles. He carried himself with an odd mix of humility and quiet confidence, as though he had once belonged in places like this, but had long since been forgotten by them. The moment he entered, whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. A few turned away in disgust, while others shot expectant glances toward the staff, waiting for someone to remove him before he could taint the air with his presence. Victor, who had been surveying the dining room from the bar, narrowed his eyes. He despised situations like this, a homeless man wandering in, thinking he could loiter in a place like the Grand Pearl. It was bad for business. He glanced toward the host stand, expecting his staff to handle it, but to his irritation, no one made a move. Then, before he could intervene, Olivia stepped forward. She approached Thomas, her expression neutral, her voice calm. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Grand Pearl. Would you like a table for one?" The murmur of disbelief from the other staff was almost audible. Victor clenched his jaw. This was exactly why he couldn't stand Oliviash. Was too soft, too willing to offer kindness where it wasn't deserved. Thomas, for his part, seemed pleasantly surprised. "Yes," he said, his voice deep and steady, as though he hadn't just been treated like an outcast by half the room. "That would be nice." Olivia led him to a small table near the back, away from the VIP section, but not so far as to seem like she was trying to hide him. As she handed him a menu, Victor stormed over, his forced smile barely concealing his irritation. "Olivia, a word." She turned to face him, her shoulders straight. "Yes, Mr. Blake." Victor leaned in, lowering his voice but ensuring his tone carried the weight of a warning. "We don't serve his kind here," he said through clenched teeth. Olivia's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "He's a paying customer, isn't he?" Victor scoffed. "You think he has money?" He cast a disdainful glance at Thomas, who had begun studying the menu with quiet interest. "Be real, Johnson. People like him come in here to beg, not to buy. Do not waste my time with this nonsense." Olivia met his gaze with quiet defiance. "If he orders and pays, he's a customer like anyone else." Victor exhaled sharply, clearly aggravated, but unwilling to cause a scene in front of the guests. "Fine," he spat. "But if he causes trouble, he's your problem." With that, he stalked off, muttering something under his breath about wasting time on nobodies. Olivia turned back to Thomas and gave him a polite smile. "Can I get you something to drink?" "A glass of water would be nice," Thomas said, a knowing gleam in his eyes. As Olivia moved to fetch it, she could feel the stares, the silent judgment radiating from the other staff, the way some of her colleagues whispered among themselves. But she ignored them. This was her job to serve without bias, without cruelty, and if that made her an outsider in this place, then so be it. Thomas took his time with the menu, his fingers running over the edges of the laminated pages, his eyes flicking between the options. When Olivia returned with his water, he offered a small smile. "I think I'll have the soup of the day and some bread," he said. "Nothing too fancy." Olivia nodded. "Good choice. Would you like anything else?" Thomas considered for a moment before shaking his head. "No, that should be enough. Thank you." As she left to place the order, Victor shot her a smug look from across the room. "Let's see how this plays out," his expression seemed to say. "Let's see how long your little act of charity lasts before he embarrasses himself." But Olivia didn't care what Victor thought. She had seen plenty of people come and go in this restaurant, plenty of rich men who treated the staff like dirt, plenty of people with money but no humanity. And yet here was a man dressed in rags, carrying himself with more dignity than half the so-called elite who dined here. She didn't know who Thomas Ramirez really was, but something told her this night was about to change everything. As the night unfolded, the Grand Pearl carried on with its usual rhythm. Servers glided between tables, balancing trays of extravagant dishes. Glasses clinked as wealthy patrons toasted to their successes, oblivious to the struggles of those who served them. Amidst the polished elegance of the restaurant, Thomas Ramirez sat quietly at his table, his demeanor unbothered by the curious glances and hushed murmurs directed his way. He sipped his water slowly, his weathered hands resting lightly on the table, waiting patiently as if he had all the time in the world. From across the room, Victor Blake kept a watchful eye on him, his lip curling in disdain every time his gaze landed on the man's tattered clothing. He had been in this business long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it, and in his mind, Thomas was nothing more than a nuisance stray who had wandered in hoping for a free meal. He had no intention of letting the night end with this man making a fool of his establishment. If Olivia wanted to waste her time serving him, fine. But the moment Thomas so much as hinted that he couldn't pay, Victor would make sure he was thrown out onto the curb where he belonged. Olivia, on the other hand, was focused on doing her job. She moved efficiently, slipping in and out of the kitchen, making sure Thomas's order was prepared with the same care as any other guests. When the chef handed her the bowl of steaming soup and a small plate of freshly baked bread, she took a moment to steady herself. She knew what everyone was thinking, that she was wasting her energy on a man who wouldn't even be able to cover his bill. But Olivia had always believed that dignity wasn't something you earned with wealth. It was something you deserved simply by being human. And tonight, no matter what anyone else thought, she would make sure Thomas was treated with dignity. Returning to his table, she set the meal down carefully. "Here you go, sir. Our soup of the day, potato leek and some warm bread to go with it. Let me know if you need anything else." Thomas looked up at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he smiled. "Thank you, young lady. This looks wonderful." Olivia gave him a small nod before stepping back, allowing him to eat in peace. She had seen enough guests in this restaurant to know the difference between those who ate mindlessly and those who truly savored their meals. Thomas was the latter. He took his time with each spoonful, his eyes closing slightly as if memorizing the flavors. He ate with a patience that was rare in a place like this, where customers were used to indulgence rather than appreciation. She was clearing a nearby table when she heard a sharp voice cut through the air. "Are we really letting this happen?" Olivia turned in time to see one of the regulars, an older woman draped in expensive jewelry, gesturing toward Thomas with a look of distaste. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but her voice carried, ensuring the entire room could hear her displeasure. "I spend thousands of dollars in this restaurant every year, and now we're just letting anyone in off the street?" Olivia's hands tightened around the empty plate she was holding. Another man chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. "Next thing you know, we'll have beggars lined up outside expecting filet mignon on the house." A few guests chuckled. Victor, sensing an opportunity to put an end to this charade, straightened his tie and strode toward the table. "I completely understand your concerns," he said smoothly, flashing a placating smile. "I assure you, the Grand Pearl maintains the highest standards. I'll personally make sure this situation is handled." He turned to Thomas, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to thinly veiled hostility. "Sir, I trust you're enjoying your meal?" Thomas, who had been unbothered by the conversation up until this point, looked up from his soup, his expression neutral. "Very much so. The soup is excellent." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. Now, I assume you have the means to pay for it." Thomas wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin, taking his time before responding. "Of course," he said simply, reaching into his pocket. For a brief moment, the restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Olivia, who had been standing a few feet away, felt an uneasy tension creep into her chest. Thomas pulled out a handful of small bills and loose change, carefully counting them out on the table. $1 here, a few quarters there, a crumpled 5 slowly, methodically. He arranged the coins and bills into a neat little pile. Then he exhaled, looking at the amount with a quiet understanding. "I seem to be a little short," he admitted, his voice calm, almost amused. "I thought I had enough, but I must have miscalculated." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor let out a sharp, triumphant breath, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. "I knew it," he sneered. "This is exactly why we don't allow." "I'd be happy to work for it," Thomas interrupted, his tone composed. "Perhaps I can wash dishes in the back. I don't mind a little hard work." Victor barked out a laugh. "Oh, please. You think I'm going to let you linger in my kitchen, getting in the way of my staff?" He turned toward the host stand and snapped his fingers. "Security." Olivia's stomach dropped. 2 men in black suits began moving toward Thomas's table. Olivia knew them. Wealth Grand Pearl didn't just hire security for show. These men were trained to remove problems as efficiently as possible. No questions asked. "Hold on," she said quickly, stepping forward before they could get any closer. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind it. "He's not trying to run out on the bill. He's offering to pay it back with work." Victor shot her a sharp look. "And I said we don't run a charity." Olivia reached into the pocket of her apron, her fingers brushing against the small bundle of tips she had collected throughout the evening. It wasn't certainly not enough to cover the kind of extravagant meals the restaurant usually served. But tonight, it wasn't about extravagance. It was about $5 worth of soup and bread. Before she could overthink it, she pulled out the money and placed it on the table next to Thomas's coins. There, bills covered. A hush fell over the restaurant. Victor's eyes darkened. "You're seriously paying for him?" Olivia met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Thomas looked at her, something unreadable flickering across his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Much appreciated." For a long moment, Victor just stood there, jaw clenched, his pride visibly battling against the reality that there was nothing he could do. With the bill settled, he had no excuse to throw Thomas out, at least not without making a scene that would tarnish his image instead of Thomas's. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he waved off the security guards. "Fine," he muttered. "But don't let me see this happen again, Johnson." Olivia said nothing. She simply picked up the empty soup bowl and walked away. As Thomas stood up to leave, he turned to Olivia one last time. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged, offering a small, tired smile. "I know." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You have a good heart," he said softly. "And good hearts are rare in places like this." Then, without another word, he walked out of the Grand Pearl and disappeared into the night. Olivia exhaled, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She didn't know why she had done it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was because, in a restaurant where wealth was everything, she had just wanted to prove that money wasn't the only thing that mattered. What she didn't know, she couldn't have known, was that this wasn't the last she would see of Thomas Ramirez. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the Grand Pearl opened its doors as it always did, welcoming the city's elite into its gleaming interior. The same expensive perfumes mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The same polished floors reflected the chandeliers above, and the same carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity hung in the air. To an outsider, it was just another day of refined luxury. But for Olivia Johnson, the weight of the previous night still lingered. She had expected the consequences. She had known the moment she placed those $5 on Thomas's table, that Victor wouldn't let it slide. And she had been right. "Johnson," Victor's voice cut through the quiet lull of the early shift, sharp and impatient. Olivia had been setting up a table near the back of the restaurant, but she straightened immediately, turning to face him. He was standing by the bar, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable but his posture stiff with irritation. "Follow me." She didn't argue. He led her through the restaurant, past the neatly dressed waitstaff preparing for the lunch rush, past the gleaming kitchen doors where chefs were already busy at work. She had assumed he was taking her to his office, but instead, he stopped just outside the employee break room, a place meant for stolen moments of rest that never lasted long enough. He turned to face her, his cold, assessing eyes locking onto hers. "Do you know how much damage you caused last night?" Olivia blinked, her hands tightening at her sides. "Damage?" Victor scoffed. "That little stunt of yours paying for that bum's meal. Do you have any idea how that makes this restaurant look? We cater to high-class clientele, Johnson. People who come here to escape reality, not be reminded that vagrants exist." Olivia's jaw clenched. He wasn't asking for a free meal. He was willing to work for it. "And I don't run a damn soup kitchen," Victor snapped. "You think those people who were complaining last night didn't notice? You think word won't spread that the Grand Pearl is suddenly the kind of place that lets in strays? You embarrassed this restaurant. You embarrassed me." Olivia swallowed back the frustration rising in her chest. "I covered his bill. There was no reason to throw him out." Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't care about $5. What I care about is the kind of people we allow in here. And I am not going to let you turn this place into some charity project. You work for me, Johnson. You do not make decisions about who belongs here." Olivia felt her nails dig into her palms, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been through this before, though maybe not this explicitly. Victor had never needed to say it outright. His actions, his tone, his expectations had always made it clear what kind of people he valued and what kind he wanted. Nowhere near his restaurant. And someone like here, a young black woman who had to fight for every inch of respect in this places. He knew better than to believe she was exempt. Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if speaking to her was exhausting. "Since you seem to have so much free time to concern yourself with people who don't matter, I've decided to adjust your responsibilities." Olivia stiffened. "From now on," Victor continued, his smirk returning, "you'll be handling additional cleaning duties. Bathrooms, floors, tables, you want everything spotless." Olivia knew exactly what this was: a punishment, a way to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "That's not my job." Victor tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Oh, I could have sworn I was the one who decided what is and isn't your job." Olivia's stomach twisted, but she said nothing. "Glad we understand each other," Victor said smoothly, stepping back. "Now get to work." Olivia turned sharply on her heel, leaving before he could say anything else. The anger simmered just beneath her skin, hot and pulsing, but she buried it deep, just as she had so many times before. She needed this job. She needed this paycheck for her mother. So she swallowed her pride, grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies, and got to work. By midday, her uniform was damp with sweat, her hands raw from scrubbing tile floors, and her legs sore from hours of bending, lifting, and wiping down every surface Victor deemed unworthy of imperfection. The scent of bleach clung to her skin, a stark contrast to the rich aromas of roasted lamb and buttered lobster wafting from the kitchen. While the other servers bustled about catering to the elite, Olivia remained in the background, invisible, just as Victor wanted. She had spent the morning silently enduring it all: his smug glances, the way her co-workers whispered behind her back, the occasional patron who sneered when they saw her kneeling on the floor with a rag in hand. It wasn't the work that humiliated her. She had never been above cleaning. It was the intent behind it, the deliberate way Victor had wielded this punishment to remind her that she was disposable, that kindness was weakness, that she had no power here. But even Victor didn't know Olivia as well as he thought he did. She wasn't weak. She was just waiting for an opportunity to prove it. She had just finished emptying a trash bin near the back entrance when she heard footsteps approaching. At first, she thought it was another staff member, maybe even Victor coming to find another excuse to berate her. But when she turned, she froze. Thomas Ramirez stood before her once again. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, Sarah Ramirez, though Olivia didn't know her name yet. She was younger than Thomas, her features sharp and striking, her posture upright and composed despite the way her clothes simple, slightly wrinkled, suggest she hadn't had the comfort of a good night's rest. Though she wasn't as visibly worn as Thomas, there was something about her presence that carried the same quiet resilience. the same unspoken weight of experience. They both looked hungry. Olivia's chest tightened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one had seen them. Thomas smiled, the same knowing, unbothered smile he had given her the night before. "Would you believe me if I said we were just passing through?" Olivia gave him a look, unimpressed. Sarah sighed. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Olivia's stomach sank. She had thought Thomas's situation was bad enough, but the idea that his sister was also struggling made it worse. Thomas chuckled at her expression. "Don't look so guilty, Miss Johnson. You already did enough for me yesterday." But Olivia didn't see it that way. Her fingers tightened around the trash bag she had been holding. If Victor caught her talking to them, she knew what would happen. But she also knew what it felt like to go without food, to watch someone you love suffer because you didn't have enough. She thought of her mother, of the nights she had skipped meals just to make sure there was more left for her. Olivia exhaled sharply, made her decision, and acted before she could talk herself out of it. "Wait here." She disappeared through the side entrance, slipping into the back kitchen, careful to avoid any wandering eyes. She knew this place like the back of her hand, where leftovers were stored before they were thrown out, which containers were set aside for employee meals, which stations were empty long enough for her to move unnoticed. She grabbed a cloth napkin and, in one swift motion, scooped up a few slices of bread, a portion of roasted chicken that had been plated but never served, and a small container of mashed potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was something. She wrapped the food carefully, clutching it tight against her chest as she hurried back outside. Thomas raised an amused brow when she thrust the bundle into his hands. "Quick hands, Miss Johnson. You sure you're in the right line of work?" Olivia huffed. "Just eat before someone sees you." Sarah didn't hesitate. She unwrapped the bread first, breaking off a piece and handing it to Thomas before taking one for herself. They ate quickly but not desperately, as though they had learned long ago how to pace themselves even when food was scarce. Olivia watched them for a moment, that familiar tightness in her chest returning. She was about to speak when a voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" "Victor." Olivia turned so fast she nearly lost her balance. Victor stood in the doorway, his expression twisted in fury, his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze flicked between Olivia and the half-eaten food in Thomas's hands, and the realization dawned on him instantly. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Olivia scrambled for words, but Victor was already moving, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. "I knew it," he seethed. "I knew you were a bleeding heart. But this," he gestured at Thomas and Sarah with disgust. "Stealing from my kitchen to feed a couple of beggars?" Olivia's heart pounded. It was going to be thrown out. "I don't care," Victor snapped. "That's not the point. You don't get to make those decisions. You don't get to take my food and hand it out like some charity worker." He was livid. And then the words came that Olivia had been dreading. "You're fired." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Olivia had prepared for this possibility. She had known she was already on thin ice, that Victor had been looking for a reason to get rid of her ever since last night. But still, the finality of it hit like a punch to the ribs. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead not for herself, but for her mother, for the job that kept them afloat. But before she could get a word out, Thomas moved. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills, and placed them directly into Victor's hand. The entire world seemed to still. Olivia froze. Victor looked down at the money, brows furrowing. "What the hell is this?" Thomas smiled, not the warm, knowing smile from before, but something sharper, more deliberate. "Payment," he said simply. Victor's scowl deepened. "For what?" Thomas tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "For the food, and for the lesson you're about to learn." Victor let out a short, incredulous laugh, glancing between Olivia and Thomas. "Oh, this is rich. You've got this guy paying your debts now, Johnson. You think that's going to save your job?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, as if studying Victor like an experiment whose outcome he already knew. Then, after a long pause, he said something that sent a chill through the air. Who said anything about saving her job? There was something vile in his tone, something almost amused. Olivia didn't understand what he meant, not yet, but she would. For a moment, Victor just stood there, staring at the crisp stack of bills in his hand, as if trying to process what had just happened. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, and for the first time that evening, he seemed at a loss for words. The anger that had flared so violently just moments ago had deadened it, because he had suddenly grown a conscience, but because money always had a way of shutting him up. Olivia could see it in his face, in the way his mind worked behind narrowed eyes. Thomas had just handed him far more than the cost of a few scraps of food. Victor had won, at least in his own mind. He had gotten what he wanted, money in his pocket. Proof that he was right about people like Thomas being beneath Hyman. With that, his interest in punishing Olivia any further seemed to wane. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head in mock amusement before stuffing the money into his pocket. "Fine," he muttered. "I don't have time for this nonsense anyway." He flicked his gaze toward Olivia, lips curling into a smirk. "But you're still on cleaning duty. You want to play the hero, Johnson? Be my guest. But don't expect any sympathy when you realize none of it was worth it." Olivia didn't respond. She watched as Victor turned on his heel and walked back inside, his posture that of a man who thought he had won. And maybe, to him, he had. But as Olivia turned back toward Thomas and Sarah, there was something in Thomas's eyes, something knowing, something almost amused that made her wonder if Victor had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't have to do that." Thomas smiled, a slow, deliberate thing. "I know." Sarah studied Olivia for a long moment before stepping closer. "We'll see you again," she said, her voice calm, steadying it a question, a statement. Olivia frowned slightly, confused by the certainty in her tone. But before she could ask what she meant, Thomas turned toward the alleyway. Sarah followed. Within moments, they had disappeared into the night. The next evening, the Grand Pearl was at its peak. The dinner rush had begun, and the restaurant hummed with the usual air of exclusivity, glasses clinking, hushed conversations, the low murmur of jazz playing beneath the sounds of indulgence. Every table was occupied by the city's elite, each guest draped in designer fabrics, their laughter laced with the easy arrogance of those who had never known hunger. The waitstaff moved in a well-rehearsed rhythm, delivering plated perfection with forced smiles, while Victor Blake stood near the bar, watching over his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had barely thought about Olivia since yesterday. She had been a nuisance, nothing more a bleeding heart in a business that required detachment. Letting her go had been inevitable, and though he had enjoyed seeing the shock on her face when he fired her, she was nothing but a footnote now. Employees came and went. He would replace her by the end of the week. Tonight was about business, about profit, about ensuring that the Grand Pearl remained what it had always been, a place for people who mattered. Then the doors opened. Victor barely glanced up at first. Patrons arrived every few minutes, always dressed in their finest, always ready to spend. But something in the air shifted. A ripple of curiosity spread through the restaurant. Heads turned, conversations faltered, the room's attention slowly converging toward the entrance, as if something or someone had tilted the balance of the room. Victor frowned, straightening, finally looking toward the entrance, and then his breath caught in his throat. Thomas Ramirez had returned, but he was no longer the man Victor had thrown out yesterday. Gone were the tattered clothes, the worn shoes, the quiet presence of a man who had been overlooked. In his place stood a figure of power, of wealth, of undeniable authority. Thomas walked into the Grand Pearl with the confidence of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. His suit was flawless, tailored to perfection, a deep charcoal that complemented the sleek timepiece on his wrist. His hair was neatly styled, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The very same guests who had sneered at him the night before now watched him with interest, with recognition, with the quiet unease that came when the rules of their world suddenly shifted. And beside him, equally composed, equally refined, was Sarah Ramirez. She was breathtaking in an elegant black dress, her sharp features framed by a confidence that was almost royal. Where Thomas exuded a quiet dominance, Sarah carried the unmistakable poise of a woman accustomed to walking into rooms and owning them. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder. A few patrons leaned toward their companions, whispering questions. "Who are they? I swear I've seen him before." "Wait, that's Thomas Ramirez." The investor, one behind. Victor felt something cold settle in his stomach. Thomas Ramirez. The name hit like a slap. Victor had heard it before. Everyone in the industry had. Thomas Ramirez wasn't just rich. He was powerful, a businessman whose investments stretched across continents. A man whose portfolio included hotels, resorts, and, most importantly, some of the most successful fine dining establishments in the world. And he had walked into Victor's restaurant last night, pretending to be nothing. Victor swallowed hard, his mind racing. Why was he here? Before he could move, Thomas's gaze swept across the room and landed directly on him. Victor stiffened. Then, to his absolute horror, Thomas smiled. It wasn't friendly, it was deliberate. He started walking, every step unhurried, measured, purposeful. Sarah followed, and as if the night hadn't already taken a turn Victor couldn't control, he noticed that Thomas wasn't just walking toward him, he was walking toward Olivia. Victor's stomach dropped. She was here. She had been standing near the back of the restaurant, where she had been helping a junior server clear plates, a job Victor had relegated her to before he fired her, just to humiliate her one last time. She still wore her uniform, but now, standing there, watching Thomas and Sarah approach, she looked like she belonged more than Victor ever had. Olivia's brows furrowed. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief as Thomas came to a stop in front of her. "Olivia," Thomas said, his voice warm, familiar, as if greeting an old friend. "It's good to see you." Olivia blinked. She hesitated, glancing between him and Sarah. "What's going on?" Sarah smiled. "We didn't get a proper chance to introduce ourselves yesterday," she said smoothly. "I'm Sarah Ramirez, and this is my brother, Thomas." Olivia stared at them. "Your brother?" Thomas chuckled, surprised. "That's an understatement." Victor's patience snapped. "All right, what the hell is this?" Thomas turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Victor forced out a chuckle. "So, let me get this straight. You walk in here last night looking like a homeless man. I catch your little act. And now you're back dressed like," he gestured vaguely. "What? You think putting on a suit is going to impress me?" Thomas tilted his head slightly. "No, but my offer might." Victor's smirk faltered. "Offer?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "I'm buying this restaurant." The room went silent. Victor stared. Then he barked out a laugh. "That's the biggest load I've ever heard." Sarah raised a brow. "Is it?" Victor's laugh died in his throat because she was holding something, now a file. She opened it with the precision of someone who had already won the game, before the opponent even realized they were playing. "The Grand Pearl," she said, skimming the documents. "Privately owned by Victor Blake, but with substantial financial backing from external investors." She flipped a page. "Investors who, as of this morning, have accepted our buyout proposal." Victor's face drained of color. Sarah snapped the file shut. "So, congratulations, Victor," Sarah smiled, sharp and merciless. "You don't work here anymore." Victor couldn't breathe. He looked at Thomas, at the calm, steady way he watched him, like he had been waiting for this moment. "You planned this," Victor whispered. Thomas smiled. "Of course." A beat of silence, then Victor lost it. He turned on Olivia, his face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," he spat. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think these people actually give a damn about you? You?" Olivia didn't flinch. She just looked at him, calm, unbothered. Then she said simply, "You should go." Victor clenched his jaw so tightly it looked painful. But he had no choice. With a final glare, he stormed toward the doors and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the restaurant that was no longer his. The moment he was gone, Thomas exhaled, then turned back to Olivia. "So," he said, smiling, "how do you feel about running this place?" Olivia stared at him. Then slowly, she smiled back. Join us at Whispers of the Soul to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Every story we share carries a message of compassion, resilience, and the extraordinary power of kindness in an often unforgiving world. Our channel celebrates the quiet heroes among Justos who, like Olivia, choose kindness when it's hardest, who stand firm in their principles even when it costs them. Through these stories, we hope to inspire a community that recognizes the value of human dignity beyond appearances and circumstances. Subscribe today and become part of a growing family that believes in the transformative power of empathy and the beautiful ripple effects of one person's courage to do what's right.